Studies Department Seminar at UW-Milwaukee. Just about monthly, we have a presentation by distinguished Black scholars who speak on a range of topics that focus across the humanities and the social sciences. And we are delighted this week to have with us Dr. George Barganier, who is going to be discussing a little bit his current book project, which focuses on the Black radical tradition and decolonial return. But he's also going to talk about Black studies generally and what are some approaches that we should take to it. But let me provide just a very quick bio for George so you can know a little bit more about him in case you haven't had the good fortune to become acquainted with his work yet. He's an associate professor of criminal justice studies at San Francisco State University. And he also currently is a visiting associate professor of Black educational and leadership traditions in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. So he has an interesting opportunity to help create a new program there. Additionally, he did his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where he subsequently held the University of California's President's Postdoctoral Fellowship. In this case, he held that at the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California. And with our most recent previous event with Dr. A.J. Rice, he currently holds that same fellowship that George held previously. It would also be, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that George was with us briefly a decade ago in our department at UW-Milwaukee in African Diaspora Studies as an assistant professor. And in that brief time that he was with us, it was just a privilege to have him around as a good conversationalist, erudite, and wide-ranging in his abilities to engage from an informed perspective, so many topics. And if I could just further add that George, Dr. Barganier, to my mind, was, I guess, what we used to call a long time ago, a working class hero of sorts, to reference a song title by John Lennon from a half century back. And that I would always get these interesting remarks from people that I knew around Milwaukee that would say, wow, I met this really interesting guy on the bus. And he talked about, these topics that we've discussed in some of our classes before, but it was so informative, instructive, and illuminating and engaging. And so I would have young people that had this palpable sense of excitement expressed after talking with George, and I always thought that reflected very highly upon him. But without further ado, let me open the floor to the person that you came here to see present and engage, and that is Dr. George Barganier. George, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Dr. Summers. And thanks, I want to say thanks first before I start to Rachel and Dr. Summers for organizing this event and putting everything together. But I just want to also say just how honored I am to be able to share this time with this department and this campus and this community. As Dr. Summers mentioned, that I started out at UWM, and it's a place that not only stays with me, but is frequently on my mind. And just really have a lot of special memories with the faculty there and the students there. And it's a place that was really foundational to my development. And had it not been for life circumstances, a place that I would still be at this day. And it really means a lot that to be invited here, because it means that I haven't been forgotten there. So I'm just really appreciative and just grateful for this opportunity today. So as Dr. Summers mentioned, I'm a visiting professor currently at the University of Pittsburgh. My work looks at the Black radical tradition and decolonial thought. And really, my interest is around Blackness, Blackness both as a social condition, but also as a space of resistance, a locus of resistance, an archive that we can turn to think about how the world works, but also think about interventions that are possible. So it's not only, how people are conditioned in society, racialized, but also the ways that we intervene and we resist. So what I'm going to talk about today, I think, is I'm going to talk about my current book manuscript, but I'm going to do that kind of briefly. What I want to do is use some of the ideas contained in the book kind of as a gateway, to have a larger conversation about what it means to do Black studies. And I think this is a great space for that, being that this is what this department is all about. And I think that having a conversation both with the faculty and students, I think this is just a great opportunity to do that. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. Just informal kind of conversation. So what I'll do, I'll share my screen here. Am I good? You can see my screen? Yeah. Jeff. All right. So what I'll do is just kind of briefly introduce not all, but some of the themes in the book. And then what I think I'll do is just kind of talk about how we go about investigating those themes. And I want to do that in a way that's not just particular to this book, but I think that can engage all of us. Okay. So the book, tentative title for now is For Known's Children, Panthers, Crips, Bloods, and the Black Radical Tradition. In the book, I examined the historical relationship between the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles and the street organizations that developed kind of in the demise, in this political vacuum, where you have the counterinsurgency from the state, and then you have the street organizations developing. And I can talk a little bit about this history, and if people have more questions, for sure, just feel free to ask and I can talk about it. But just, I'll say briefly that, many people are not aware that the Crips and Bloods actually originated not only in 1969 when the Black Panther Party was at its height and kind of, under this kind of siege from the state, but the young man who first organized the organization that we know as the Crips actually grew up on the same street as Prentice Bunchy Carter, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. So I can mention a little bit about that. But the book looks at this historical relationship between these organizations and kind of the, Black radical organizations and then the street organizations that developed out of that. But that's not my major interest. My interest is Black consciousness, right? And so how Black people see themselves in the world, but also how we're racialized. And what I do is look at that kind of historical period where you see this kind of height of political activity with the Black Panther Party, and then you kind of see into the 80s, this kind of internalization where people are turning on each other, and try to understand how that shift happened, the state's role in that, but also how the street gangs thought of themselves, but also how they attempted to resist. And it turns out that the story is not as neat as we think, right? We kind of think that you have these politically active, Black Panthers, and then you have these street gangs that are full of self-hate, and that's a kind of easy explanation. But it turns out, as you kind of unpack the history, that there's always this current of kind of internalization and resistance. So this is what the work kind of does generally. So let me just outline what I'll do today, and then I'll get into everything. So I'm gonna give a brief introduction of the problem, or what I see as the problem under investigation with the book. And then I'll give a brief description of the book. So I'm just gonna give an outline of the chapters just to give people a sense of how I'm kind of thinking about things and attacking things. And then what I'll do is kind of look at the implications. And when I say implications, I don't mean just for me, but I think more for Black studies, right? And I'll do that by talking about the Black radical tradition, okay? And I'll do that by talking about a little bit of what's contained in chapter 4. I sent out a brief reading. If you're here today and you didn't get a chance to see that, don't worry, it's not really important. It'll help you give idea of the work I do, but we can still have the conversation even if you weren't able to see it. All right, so let's start with this kind of idea of the problem under investigation, just to give people an idea of what it is I do specifically with the book. So as I mentioned, I look at this kind of history and this relationship between the Black Panther Party and how the street organizations develop in the wake and in the demise of the party. The problem under investigation for me is if you look at, the majority of the literature on what they would call street gangs, there are usually only two explanations, right? And one is that the street gangs themselves are pathological, right? And the explanations are usually either economic or cultural, right? The cultural arguments we all know very well. Black people have different cultural values, and therefore, in the inner cities, especially in poorer areas, their culture is going to reflect some sorts of pathologies. Or we have the more economic explanations, and those are usually the explanations that, in areas that are highly impoverished, where you don't have, middle class organization capabilities, that people adapt in order to survive. And, they developed their own institutions, and these institutions are necessarily pathological because, they're going to mirror and reflect what they see in society. And they're usually economic. They're usually along arguments along the lines that, there's no economic opportunity, so people turn to the streets, to survive economically, and so on and so forth. So these type of explanations are very problematic, as we all know, for many reasons. But one of the reasons I want to focus on today is they fail to see not just the reality of what happens on the streets, but they fail to see Black people as conscious moral actors. So in other words, Black people are just victims of their circumstances, and not conscious social beings that intervene on their society, on their social conditions, right? So people are not consciously thinking, they just kind of mirror the oppression. So what I want to talk about today is really not these kind of, oversimplified, notions of Blackness that are very easily to dismiss. I think what I want to do is kind of talk more about the radical traditions, and that being like, radical traditions, white radical traditions on the left. I'll talk a little bit about Marxism and how Marxism provides a necessary but insufficient lens to look at what's happening. All right. Okay, so I'm giving the specifics of my work, but I like, as I mentioned, I want to talk more in general about Black studies. So this is the specifics that I'm looking at. But in general, what I'm going to talk about is applicable to anybody that studies Black people, right? And studies any type of phenomenon related to Black people, right? So, I might be looking at this historical relationship between the Panthers and the street organizations, but the type of explanations about these organizations that I just mentioned are prevalent, not just amongst or around all different types of questions, but throughout the different disciplines, all right? And so what I'm going to argue for is to move actually beyond the disciplines, and that the problem itself is the disciplines themselves are Eurocentric, and the disciplines themselves are thinking about Black people as a problem, right? All right, so let me just turn to a quick description of the book, and then what I'll do is get into kind of like what I mentioned about like how we do Black studies, all right? So I'm just going to outline the chapters briefly, just let everyone know kind of how I lay things out. So what I do in the first chapter as of now is called Guerrilla Intellectualism and the Decolonial Turn. Guerrilla Intellectualism was a concept that Walter Rodney used, right? And so what I'm laying out in the first chapter is part of what I'll be talking about today. Is I'm problematizing like the radical white left and how it's a necessary but insufficient lens. And I lay out, kind of piece by piece how they fail to understand race in a sufficient manner, which is what I'll talk about in a moment. And then I talk about thinking from subaltern spaces. In other words, thinking from the perspective of Blackness, right? And how thinking from the perspective of Blackness not only gives us a better analysis and understanding of Black people, but gives us a better understanding of the power structures that racialize us, right? And gives us an insight, right, to how the world operates. So it gives us a better view of how capitalism operates, gives us a better view of how gender operates, gives us a better view of how race operates. And I kind of lay that out in the chapter. And again, if there are questions on that, I can talk about that. In the next chapter, what I do is I start historically. I talk about the making of Black Los Angeles. I actually start in 1555. And I won't give too many details, but for anybody that doesn't know, Los Angeles was partly founded by Black people. California is named after a mythical Black woman that comes from a romance novel. And what I do is I problematize this idea of race by showing historically for people of African descent that they actually had more political rights in early California, right, in the 16th and 17th and even 18th century than they did in 1965 at the time of the Watts Uprising. And I do that to say, okay, if race is socially constructed, well, we have to understand how it was constructed historically, and we have to lay this out. In order to understand what's happening in 1980, what's happening in 1999, what's happening in 2000, you have to understand how race was constructed. And so I talk about this kind of violent social production of race, and I go through it historically. And then the chapters kind of go historically after that. I look in the chapter 3, I look at the rise of the Black Panther Party, particularly in Los Angeles, and how they heavily recruited from the street, what we would traditionally call street gangs, but from the street organizations that came prior to the Black Panther Party. In fact, Bunchy Carter, who I mentioned, was head of the largest street gang in Los Angeles before he joined the Black Panther Party. So I talk about that to kind of rethink, this idea of what it means to be politically conscious. And then chapter 4 is the focus on the kind of first generation of the Crips, and then how the Bloods develop after. From 1969, I go into about the late 70s, and just talk about one, how they kind of mirrored themselves after the Panther Party, but then I also start to talk about the contradictions that existed, right? And how young Black people were thinking about resistance, right, in a historical period, right, where the conditions of possibility were such that they were facing this massive onslaught from the state, right, and how things developed, right, and rethinking some of the political expressions, some of the cultural expressions within that context, all right, within this context of COINTELPRO, where people were literally assassinated by the state, were kidnapped and thrown in cages by the state, right? And so talking about this and how this develops. In chapter 5, it's called The Return of the Spook Hunters. For people who never heard of this term, this was a violent white terrorist street gang in Los Angeles that operated in the 1950s, that kind of racialized the borders between the Black and white communities in Los Angeles. And in this chapter 5, is actually about the 1980s and about the police. And I call it Return of the Spook Hunters because I'm saying the police fulfill the role of the spook hunters. So what I look at in this chapter is how prior to the 1980s, right, that the responsibility for racial violence lay not only on the state, but civil society, right? So you had organizations like the Spook Hunters, youth organizations, like you had in the South, you had the Klan, right, that shared in the kind of responsibility of racial violence. But in the 1980s, the police actually become the monopoly of this kind of violence, and it becomes even more institutionalized than it had been in prior decades. And I look at that kind of turn in the 1980s, and it becomes formalized, and it becomes formalized through a language of gang suppression, right? And gang suppression, it's operating under a logic of racial violence, but it's through this type of language of suppressing gangs. And I lay out how that happens. But another thing I lay out is how the state, and everybody knows this now, it's common knowledge, it's not conspiracy theory anymore, but how we understand it is crucial. How the state, right, was responsible for the selling of cocaine, right? The quote unquote crack epidemic in Los Angeles, right? And the state's involvement in that. And I look at that through a different lens. And I'll mention world systems in a moment, but I look at what was happening in Central America and how the state utilized what we would call chemical warfare in the ghettos to suppress some of the political things that were happening. Chapter 6, I look at the 1992 uprising. Thug Life comes from Tupac, of course. And I look at how the political consciousness amongst the street gangs starts to develop, but then again, it's suppressed by the state. And so that's what chapter 6 looks like. Chapter 7, I kind of switch gears and what I call Mike Browntown. I look at Ferguson and the Ferguson Uprisings, St. Louis area, like many places in the United States, for reasons that I talk about earlier in the book, heavily influenced by the street organizations that develop out of Los Angeles. So I have a place in Ferguson that the Crips and Bloods are very common, right? And I look at the uprisings in Ferguson, and I look at how the early moments of the uprisings were actually driven by the street organizations. So it was the street organizations, amongst other people that were radical, that were on the streets, that had radical demands, and how the state reacts, and how it turns out how the state reacts is not just through violent suppression, but they do what they also did in the early 60s, and they bring an alternative, all right, that is more politically desirable for the state. And that alternative is some of the people from the Black Lives Matter movement that are brought in, right, that come from nowhere and are brought in. Some people, not everybody, not what I'm saying, but certain individuals within the Black Lives Matter that are promoted by the state, right? While you have 3 key individuals that were leading the movement on the street that are murdered and die mysteriously within Ferguson. So I look at like some of the political undercurrents, what's happening on the streets, how people are organizing themselves, and the subversion tactics used by the state, because subversion is not always just through these violent means, but it's oftentimes the promotion of what Frantz Fanon would call the soothsayers, right? The people whose responsibility is to turn those kind of radical demands and formulate them into these kind of more liberal ideas of accommodation, right? So I look at that turn. And then in the last chapter, what I look at is the actual prison organizations. So you have Crips and Bloods who inside the prisons begin to radicalize themselves and try to return to their kind of early mission of the organizations. And they organize what the state would call prison gangs, but they organize these political organizations, and it's called Kiwete Muntu. So Kiwete, Kiwes, Crips call themselves Kiwes. Kiwete means cripple in Swahili, and Bloods call themselves Damu. Damu means blood in Swahili. And you have people within the prisons, right, literally studying from George Jackson to Frantz Fanon and organizing themselves. And I look at the possibilities with those organizations, the contradictions and the possibilities, all right? And what I end up arguing is that if we look at some of their arguments, that they actually have a better analysis of their conditions than the overwhelming majority of the things that we see in the academy. All right, so that's the kind of, the book in its entirety. So what I want to do is talk for a minute, make sure I'm good on time, but I want to talk for a minute about kind of what this means for Black studies and the implications, okay? Beyond just my specific topic. So one, how we understand Blackness. So, I'm looking at particularly young Black males and over the generations. And so one of the things that I think the book is useful for is how we understand Blackness, right? And that's both in terms of a social condition, but also as a locus of resistance. So what I mean as a social condition, like how we are racialized in our lived experiences, and how the state and civil society is responsible for this, but also as a locus of resistance, like the interventions and the possibilities for alternatives that Black people have developed and can continue to develop. All right. And I want to talk about how we kind of think about that. All right. So how we go about our analysis. And I don't know how many grad students or students are on today, but for me, this is, I think, the essential part of our conversation, because oftentimes we think we're doing Black studies because we're studying Black people, right? But what's important is not what we're studying, but how we're studying, right? Because we can study Black people with the same Eurocentric disciplines and have the best intentions, but reproduce the same type of Eurocentric logic. All right. So it's not just about the what we're studying, but the how we're studying. And this is the legacy of Black studies. It was born out of resistance. It was literally born out of people occupying buildings and struggling. And I always have to remind my students, that it doesn't matter who I am, where I come from, or what I look like. if I'm reproducing some of these sociological, analyses of race, that I'm colonizing the space that was liberated territory within the classroom. And so we need to think about how we ask questions, right? Not just what we're asking. And what I'm going to argue and advocate for is that we need to think about those spaces of Blackness and how those spaces help us understand not just Blackness, but understand the logic of the system that we live under. Okay, so the what versus the how. All right, so just in the chapter that I sent, and as I mentioned, it's not if you weren't able to see it, I'm sorry. It's okay. But so in that chapter, what I'm looking at specifically, the violent social production of race and dehumanization, and what Frantz Fanon would call the zone of non-being, but also how Black people, are conscious moral actors. And what I mean by that are consciously thinking about and consciously intervening, right, on the structures that are organizing their lives. And what I mentioned in the beginning with the traditional types of analyses, not just around street gangs, but around Blackness itself, it's lacking the ability to understand and interpret how Black people are conscious moral actors, right? So we're thinking of Black people as subjects, right? Just as objects, and not as conscious like subjects that are intervening and acting. So I want to talk about kind of Black studies and how we go about doing that. All right. So the how. So my work, as I mentioned, centers around the Black radical tradition. But for me, the Black radical tradition provides a framework for analyzing capitalism and race as iterative and mutually constitutive historical structures, okay? So the Black radical tradition helps us understand, right, how Blackness is not simply a byproduct of capitalism, but how historical capitalism in its real existing form, right, is dependent on race, and race is a constitutive element of the logic of capitalism itself. And for that, in order to have that analysis, I turn to the work of Cedric Robinson and others, right? Another, think, key insight of the Black radical tradition is how institutions actively produce, sustain, and reproduce racial power relations as an integral component of the systemic logic of historical capitalism. In other words, race is not only constitutive to capitalism, right, but it's integral to the continued development of capitalism, right? Ultimately, it's also part of its demise, but capitalism is dependent on race. And that's the argument that I'm making. And that's the argument that distinguishes the Black radical tradition from some radical Eurocentric thought on the left. And I'll talk just for a brief moment about how the Black radical tradition is able to see things that traditional Marxist thought would be unable to see. And then we'll open for questions. Okay. So one other key thing, and we'll see if we get there, but also the Black radical tradition enables us to think about how we read the generative aspects of Blackness. So the creative aspects of Blackness, which if we have time, we can talk about some of the trends in Afro-pessimism. But I think Black radical tradition is able to read the creative aspects of Blackness in ways that many Afro-pessimists are not able to. So if we have time, we'll get there. All right, so let me just talk briefly about this kind of intervention that the Black radical tradition helps us to reach by talking about what I see as two analytic missteps of Eurocentric thought, Eurocentric methodologies. And by this, I'm talking specifically to like the radical thought on the left being Marxism, and how Black radical tradition is able to understand race beyond a byproduct of capitalism. And if you have questions on this, please ask, because I think this is key for all of us. All right. So two analytic missteps, time and space. And I can talk about what I mean by this. But what I'm arguing is that Marx himself and Marxists fail to see how race is constitutive to capitalism because in their analysis, right, they're zooming in and looking at time and looking at space in ways that are confined. And when we look at a larger and a broader temporal and spatial analysis, that being world systems, we're able to see certain contradictions that Marxism is unable to see. All right. And so I'm going to advocate for a kind of decolonial world systems approach. And so let me, before I even go there, let me say what I mean by this. All right. So I'm not sure how well versed in Marxism, some of the students are, but, please ask questions on this. Marx understands wage labor as constitutive to the capitalist process. Wage labor as constitutive to the capitalist process, meaning wage labor is part of the internal logic of capitalism in and of itself. Because Marx is looking at, remember, England and the rise of the Industrial Revolution within England. And so what Marx sees is that wage labor, right, is an integral part to the development of capitalism. And Marx sees capitalism also as developing in England in a particular historical moment, okay? And he sees it developing, particularly, he looks in the 19th century with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and makes the argument, right, that wage labor is constitutive to the development of capitalism. What he argues about what was happening in the colonies, that is coerced forms of labor. So now I'm talking about things like slavery, right? So the capital that was accumulated as a result of slavery, Marx understands as another form of economic development, right? That was in content and form different from capitalism, and they label this the primitive accumulation of capital. In other words, what Marx is saying, right, is that the people that were kidnapped, right, the captives that were taken from Africa, right, that were forced to labor in the Caribbean and South America and what is now the United States, right, so coerced forms of labor, right, was something called a part of a process of the primitive accumulation of capital. And the primitive accumulation of capital was then responsible, allowed the capitalist class to develop the Industrial Revolution, but is something that is on the exterior of capitalism and is not part of capitalism and capitalist development itself. So please, if ask questions if you're not getting the argument that I'm making now. But the point is that Marx sees, right, slavery as something that is distinctively different from capitalism. All right. Now there are others, right, like Oliver Cox, Manuel Wallerstein, Frantz Fanon, right, radical Black scholars that want us and ask the question that how do we rethink this, right? If indeed enslavement of African people was something that was distinctive from capitalist development, right? Then how do we understand the plight of people who were racialized? And for Marx, what Marxists generally understand race, they understand it as the byproduct of capitalism, right? And let me say something briefly on that, and then I'll return to this thing on time and space. So for Marxists, they understand race when I say the byproduct of capitalism. The argument is usually, right, that in a place where you have an enslaved population, let's take the United States, for example, right? And you have people who are laboring as an enslaved labor force, right? That are not able to participate, right, in the quote unquote American dream, right? That you need to develop an ideological excuse for this, right? So for wage laborers, you can provide the belief that if you work hard, you will succeed. But people who are enslaved are working hard and they're never moving out of this condition. So the idea of race was created, right, to legitimize the enslavement of Black people. So it was purely economical. So for Marxists, race is part of what they would call superstructure, right? That it's an ideological consequence of economic relations, all right? What Fanon and other people would argue is that race itself is not simply a byproduct of capitalism, but it's constitutive to capitalist development. And they do that by broadening their temporal and spatial analysis by understanding, one, that capitalism did not just simply develop inside Europe, that it developed on a global scale, and then their temporal analysis, that it developed in a longer historical period. So what World Systems argues is that we need to broaden our lens, right? And look at a larger period of history and understand from the first captive that they kidnapped from Africa, that capitalism was already in motion, but also by a spatial analysis, you don't simply look at what was happening within Europe, you understand that European nation states were never simply nation states, they were empires. And that was happening in the colonies is constitutive to capitalist development, meaning that capitalism itself is not just dependent on wage labor, it's also dependent on coerced forms of labor. And when you do this, then it's gonna lead you to additional questions. And that is, can you simply explain the Black experience through economic relations? Can you simply explain the Black experience through economic relations? Meaning, is Blackness simply a byproduct of economic relations, or is Blackness something else? That's the question that it leads you to. And the Black radical tradition urges us to think about what that something else is, and to move beyond not just economic explanations, but also culturalist explanations, and understand how ideology and economics work in more complex ways. All right. I can say specifically how we do this, how I do that, what scholars I turn to, but I kind of just want to pose the question, and then we can kind of think about it, and then I can answer questions. But I don't want to go into too much detail. What I want to kind of pose is a fundamental question, and that is how we understand Blackness, and how even the radical explanations tend to reduce Blackness to a particular understanding that is insufficient, and that is just simply an economic explanation. All right. I think I'll probably just end with this quote, but this is a quote from Cedric Robinson, and this is Blackness. Black radicalism is a negation of Western civilization, but not in the direct sense of a simple dialectical negation. It is certain that the evolving tradition of Black radicalism owes its peculiar moment to the historical interdiction of African life by European agents. This experience, though, was merely the condition for Black radicalism, its immediate reason for and object of being, but not the foundation for its nature or character. Black radicalism, consequently, cannot be understood with the particular context of its genesis. And what Cedric Robinson is arguing here is that Blackness itself is thinking from a space of relative exteriority, that Blackness itself is not simply a dialectical negation of Eurocentrism. What he's meaning is it's not just reflected and born out of modernity, but it still carries the legacies from Africa. And if we utilize, right, Blackness as a critical space, we can think about not just Blackness in and of itself, but we can think about the power structures that are operating in our lives on a daily basis. So for Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition, epistemology is central to our resistance. And the reason why it's central to our existence is because in order for us to imagine and think of alternatives to a future world, we have to think beyond, right, Eurocentrism. And we have to think beyond the alternatives that Eurocentrism provide us. And we need to think from the space. And when he's saying this, Cedric Robinson, and in my opinion, is thinking very very literally about the experiences of everyday Black people, right? And how our everyday experiences, right, can provide a resource for us to think about not just our own condition, but think about the possibilities in the future in the world that we want to live in. And I think it becomes incumbent upon us as scholars to take that very seriously, because what we do very often, even in Africana studies departments, is we take the disciplines and we take kind of Eurocentric thought and we project that and extrapolate the ideas that were born in a particular historical moment, in a particular place, that being Europe, to think about the experiences of Blackness. And what Cedric Robinson is saying is, no, we need to think from our own positionality, because our own positionality, right, allows us to think from a space of exteriority and think about not just our conditions, but the interventions that we think are possible. And I think I'll stop there. I know it's a lot, but I think I'll stop there. So that way, if there's any questions, I can talk more in depth and steer things in the way people would like it to go.
Sorry, George, it took me a while to unmute. Thank you so much for a sweeping analysis that started with a locale and specific point in time, and then broadened it both across time and space, very much in the best traditions of some of the intellectual schools of thought that I know inform your work, but of which you are adding some original perspectives too. So we want to open this up now, of course, to others to offer a comment or questions. And you can do so in one of two ways. You can appear on screen and ask your question, or you can offer your remarks just in the chat function. So I'm happy to take those. So if anyone would like to speak, please digitally raise your hand and we can accommodate that, or use the chat function. While those questions or comments either or not come, I have a couple of questions I would like to start with. One is just kind of an aside, not a matter of theory. And that is thinking about LA, and you would mention this historical reference, one that I wasn't knowledgeable of, this group in LA that you called the Spook hunters that were trying to maintain a color line. Has any scholarship been done linking that organization to people who later came to positions of power within the police department, people like Daryl Gates, of course, the notorious chief of police in LA in the 1980s?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I actually, in my work, I read extensively Daryl Gates' autobiography. It's called Chief. And Daryl Gates himself, he wasn't part of the Spook Hunters, but he was part of a different racial gang. And he brags in the book about going to Boyle Heights and beating up young Chicano youth, right? I'm not aware of any scholarship, but one of the things that I'm looking at is how like those exact individuals later become the police and the Black quote unquote gangs become the criminals, right? And then how you see a shift, particularly after 1992 uprisings, where you start to see the integration of Black people into the LAPD, into particular positions, and also as corrections officers to kind of legitimize what was happening. And so it's this kind of strange twist, right, where you have this kind of increased racialization through a lens of like a post-racialization, right? And so you have the occupation of communities with Black police officers, Black and brown police officers, Black and brown corrections officers, and this at first serves as a tactic to kind of legitimize the work that's happening, but it comes as a result of struggle, because after 92 people are pushing, right? And then you see the state kind of turn to these reforms, and then it ends up, it's just the back and forth that happens. I have seen some historical work on how the LAPD before Daryl Gates heavily recruited from the South. And so they would get a lot of police officers would come from the South in the 60s and 50s. So, yeah.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know the latter. An old colleague of ours, Patrick Bellegarde Smith, would like to offer a comment, but we're having a tech issue here. He doesn't want to do it via the chat function, which I understand. So I'm hoping that maybe Rachel Hegland, our program administrator, can perhaps enable whatever function would allow him to do that. Rachel, so if you're listening in, let's see what we can do to get Patrick on screen as he wants to ask.
I just
George,
promoted him to panelist. Patrick, if you can hear me, if you could unmute yourself, it will be at the bottom left of your screen.
Thanks, Rachel.
The video.
Well, I was hoping to write out my question because I could think it through that way. And it's unfortunate that the chat has been disabled. But Black radicalism, from my standpoint, is a very normal response to oppression. But the word itself, radical, could be misleading and scary to a lot of people, including some Black folks, for what actually occurs. For instance, as an example of this, AOC and her group in the US House of Representatives is considered radical, and people like Senator Manchin is considered moderate. And so words themselves matter a great deal. By the way, I enjoyed the presentation greatly. It sets me thinking. There's a lot of work to do. And indeed, the Black Studies Department across the nation have used, for the most part, a Eurocentric approach. And we need to rectify this, starting by the words that we use ourselves. The very same words that are used elsewhere should not necessarily be used by us. That's it.
Well, good, Patrick. It's good to hear from you. But yeah, I think I do think though that, you know, it with Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism, I think he, you know, one of the things he is doing is clearly establishing how he understands Black radicalism as an epistemology and as a epistemological break from Eurocentric thought. And so I do think by radicalism, he's thinking from Blackness as a standpoint. And I think, you know, he would have a clear definition of what he means by radical and Black radical. And I think in my estimation, you know, that means thinking beyond the bounds of Eurocentrism, right? And so, I mean, we could be radicals, right, and still thinking from, you know, the paradigm of Eurocentric thought. But I think what he's saying and what he's establishing the Black radical tradition is it doesn't mean Black people too. So let me be clear on that. And there are some readings and things too I could recommend for everyone. But you know, the Black radical tradition doesn't mean a Black person who's radical. It means thinking from the spaces of subalternity, right? So it means think just like you can be, you know, not be a woman and have those experiences, but still be a feminist. And it means thinking from those historical spaces and what those social historical spaces get us in terms of understanding how the world operates, right? So to be a Black radical or to think from the Black radical tradition, it doesn't, one, simply mean you're a Black person, as he says, I mean, quite clearly that most Black thought is not from the Black radical tradition, right? But it also doesn't mean that you're, you know, it's only from Black people that you can think from that positionality. And so I think that he does, you know, kind of outline this. I saw a question in the chat. Should I go ahead and answer that? I think.
Yeah, George. Go ahead, please.
All right. So why do we begin with Marxism to understand or talk about Black people's experience? In your opinion, why is Marxism important to understanding the Black experience? I don't think Marxism is necessarily important to understanding the Black experience. I do think that Marxist thought itself does illuminate, you know, very important aspects of how the world operates. I think it is insufficient. I think that there are other traditions that help us see other things. And in the words of Fanon, he says that's why Marxism always has to be skewed when thinking about, you know, the colonial question, when thinking about race. So I don't think it's necessarily, you know, central or important to start with Marxism. The reason why I did today is because I think it's particularly in this space, it's really easy to just kind of dismiss the more, you know, reactionary and liberal analyses of Blackness. So let's start and think with something that's more radical. And that was kind of my objective today. But I don't think it's, necessary.
Just as an aside, of course, Marx's nickname was the Moor.
Yeah.
And he declared himself not to be a Marxist, but that doesn't mean that something
Exactly.
called
Yeah.
Marxism doesn't exist, because it certainly does. Of course, many different schools of thought within it. But go ahead, George. I'm sorry.
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. So then there's another question here. Could you please discuss the implications of your thesis? More specifically, one question is whether this approach is discouraging. If racism is so ingrained and has such long historical roots, then can it be eliminated? Yeah, so any product of history can be eliminated. Will it be, and how will it be? I mean, that's the importance of the work, right? So, Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party has a wonderful quote on theory and practice. And that is, he said, in the Black Panther Party, we love theory. We understand you need theory, but theory without practice is bullshit. And that's his direct quote, right? The purpose of theory is to understand the conditions that we find ourselves in order to be strategic in our interventions. And if we don't have theory, then we don't have a sense of what we're fighting against. So that's the importance, and that's the implications of it. If you're otherwise you're just kind of swimming upstream and not really knowing where we're heading. So the first thing is that we have to have a thesis, and we have to have an analysis in order to find a space for critique. So then let's see, if racism is so ingrained, is it discouraging? All the structures of power that we're operating under are ingrained. And that's why it's a system, right? And it has institutions, and it has individuals, and it has logics, and it's a protracted struggle, right? If we, and this is just my personal beliefs, but as we find ourselves on this earth, we should struggle to make this a better place in any ways we can, and one of that is through thinking and acting, right? And so yes, it's discouraging. It can be it's discouraging when you go out of your house and you see the conditions, the shit that they do to people. This is a fucked up world, excuse me, but there's, you don't even have to, you go overseas and you see like children starving and these things, but you can go outside of your house and you see like what they do to people. And the thing is, in order to undo that, we have to think about it and act on it. And if we're not really thinking about it, then how are we going to act upon it? And what I'm ultimately trying to have with this conversation today, and this is why I was trying to lay out some radical critiques, is even when we're thinking as radicals, that we can end up mystifying what's really happening. And so we have to understand, and that's what I was trying to get at with this understanding of race, is we have to have a really sophisticated analysis of what's happening with race, because as Marx has argued, right, is that the way for race to go away is to do what? Is seize the means of production, and you have national liberation struggles, but we all know race never disappeared, right? So we have to understand the complexity of not just race, but also capitalism, how it operates on a global scale. We have to understand modernity and how it operates, right? And if we don't, we'll continue to live in these conditions. And so that's the importance of study. That's the importance of struggle. I don't know if I answered that, but.
George, I have another matter I would like your impressions of, since you're not getting the question in advance. I mean, that's what we'll be getting rather than anything well-developed or thought out. But just in terms of the political economy of the United States, and focusing more on kind of a materialist approach, you're, of course, from your time in Milwaukee, well familiar with the impact that deindustrialization had on our industrial city. A place that the Wall Street Journal once called the star of the snow belt. I mean, wages were so high, and it appeared for a short period of time, despite racism and oppression, that opportunities were, beginning to emerge, at least on the economic front. And then, of course, we take this massive hit, and we become one of the poorest cities in terms of household income in the United States. But so we've had, what I've often termed these upper Midwest industrial cities, in which the Black labor of the Great Migration became orphaned.
Yeah.
You know, they for just maybe like a bit over a generation, you know, we saw these opportunities open up, and then that came with an attendant cultural development. You know, if we think about, you know, Detroit and Motown and all this other stuff that just arose in such short order out of this richer economic environment, and then of course everything kind of implodes. But it seems as though after nearly a half century of you know, this deindustrialization, the Paul Volcker shock, and you know, all of the economic and then dysfunctionalities that followed from that, that we have this kind of interesting new opening arising as a consequence of changing demographics. So, you know, we know that Donald Trump actually slowed down immigration to the United States somewhat. So we have less new labor here. African-American population rates have been kind of constant as a percentage of the population, which means that there's a fair number of young people. But if we take a look at whites, they are a declining demographic group, and especially young people. So in other words, we're running out of white young workers.
Yeah.
And what prospects might we see for Black labor exercising some greater agency in this environment of all of a sudden there being a need for young Black labor? And not only are we seeing it with Black labor, but we're seeing universities who are scrambling for student enrollments because, you know, the young white students have just disappeared as a demographic group. They're just not as large as they used to be. And so now there's this kind of chase after, you know, Latinos and African Americans and all the rest. So it seems as though the system, you know, as it ever slowly turns, is kind of now all of a sudden creating an opportunity for especially young African Americans to maybe exercise some more power.
Yeah, but I think it's, I mean, so one, it's you know, that's happening in the context of global developments, right? But it's also happening in a same historical period when we're seeing, you know, the mass exodus of Black people from urban centers, right? And being kind of the surplus proletariat being pushed out through this whole gentrification process. And, you know, the United States beginning to look like, you know, many places in Europe where, you know, Black and brown people are forced to the outer rings of the city.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's, you're seeing this kind of complex development where there is this integration of certain aspects, but at the same time, this increased kind of exclusion, right? And it's happening. It's happening in the same time, like when Black people are still living under this perpetual kind of state of violence where the cities are still policed in a particular way. So yeah, I think, you know, that's why I think world systems is so important, is to understand those developments. Otherwise we get kind of, you know, trapped in these kind of liberal explanations that things are getting better for Black people if we just look at this or just look at that. But I think you're exactly right. You know, it has to do with labor shortages and, yeah.
Okay, we have used our hour, and I want to thank you, Dr. Barganier, again for generously providing your time and perspectives on these important issues, and hopefully they will help our students and faculty alike advance their thinking on them. Looking forward to seeing what you do at Pitt. It sounds like a remarkable opportunity to help give shape to a new institution as it emerges, so it sounds quite exciting.
Thank you for everyone. Sorry, I was still looking at some of the questions and things there, but yeah, I really appreciate having this.
Now, unless oh, okay, no, hold on. We do have okay. I'll tell you what. If you don't mind, just because I want to do justice to those who have asked the questions, do you have time to?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's do that. George, why don't you engage these last questions that have just arrived?
Yeah, so We are seeing the Latin Americanization of the United States. What does this do with the ongoing presence of oppression? Biracial category was tried in South Africa. And yeah, so I mean, even the concept of whiteness, the concept of blackness, it's fluid, right? Which leads us to another theoretical question about what race actually is and who's considered human and non-human. But I think that has to do with exactly what we just mentioned previously, right? With like global developments and how not just racism is fluid, but how the kind of responses to not just economic demands of the state, but how we see how certain groups are able to move in certain directions, whether it be through class or race. And the other one I think is a comment. Yeah, so the other one's just a comment just about the slides and the discussion. So I appreciate that, Rachel. I don't know if there's any other questions I don't see here.
That's all I see right now. But Rachel's comment returns back to my kind of original point in my introduction regarding how much our students liked you and your style of the presentation of your material. So I'm not surprised to see that affirmation of your engaging means of delivering ideas. Well, George, again, thank you so much. And I'm hoping we'll stay in touch.
Oh, definitely.
Continue to see those great ideas coming from you.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for just coming and hanging out. I really appreciate it.
A good way to spend a Friday morning.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Yeah.
Take care now.
Oh, okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.